Very welcome to the Global Award for Entrepreneurship Research 2018. My name is Johan Eklund. I'm Managing Director of Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum. And it's a pleasure to see so many friends of entrepreneurship gathered here today. I'd like to give a short background to the Global Award for Entrepreneurship Research. This is a prize that was founded in 1996, and today it's awarded for the 23rd time. And over the years, 27 scholars have been awarded the prize for their work and contributions to our understanding of entrepreneurship. The prize was founded by Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum, and the co-founder is the Research Institute of Industrial Economics, EFN, and it's supported by a generous support by Vinnova, the Swedish Innovation Agency, and a generous donation by the Swedish Köpmannaklubb. The prize consists of The Hand of God by Carl Milles. You can see it in the background here on the picture, a bronze statue. And it was molded by Carl Mille to honor the entrepreneur C.E. Johansson, who was an innovator and entrepreneur who revolutionized precision measuring. And together with this bronze statue, the award is also 100,000 euros. The prize is awarded to a wide range of topics and disciplines, and they can be in a wide set of areas. And those students of economics are familiar with names such as Ursula Kirchner, Kathleen Eisenhart, Marianne Feldman, Philippe Aguillon, and Arnaud de Soto. And today, the prize is awarded to Olav Sorenson, which we'll hear more about in a few minutes. Prize contributions that are worthy of prize needs to be original, and they need to be influential. And one can think of many ways that the prize is influential and makes a contribution. Most notably through its impact on subsequent scientific work, but also by furthering entrepreneurship as a field, furthering entrepreneurship education and training at an academic level, but also by influencing policy making and society in a more broad sense. Over the longer time span, the award-winning contributions should reflect the extraordinary width of entrepreneurship as a social science, spanning the entire spectrum from anthropology to theoretical microeconomics, and also reflecting the wide diversity, methodological diversity. And previous prize winners mirrors this management scholars as well as geographers and economists have received the prize. It is also very important to ascertain a high quality in the selection process of the prize. And this prize selection process should be continuous, and it should be robust. Therefore, there is a prize committee, which I'm sure you will hear more about throughout the afternoon, that makes a broad evaluation of various candidates, creating a pool of candidates from which the winner is selected. And in order to have a robust body of pool of candidates, the prize committee, in effect, inherits a list of shortlisted candidates from previous years. And with a very few exceptions, the winners, in rare cases, winners will be selected from this pool of shortlisted candidates. And all shortlisted candidates are thoroughly evaluated by a specialist in the field. And this evaluation then forms the basis for the winners, an article, a scientific review article of the winner's work, written together by the expert and a member of the prize committee who is most familiar with the research. And as I said, the prize is the statue and 100,000 euros, generously supported by Vinnova and the Stockholm Köpmannaklubb. This year's prize winner, Olav Sorenson, in a sense reflects the breadth of the prize. Olaf is receiving the prize because he's successfully combined insights from sociology, economic geography, as well as economics. And as I'm sure you'll hear more about, Olav Sorensen's contributions can be categorized into 3 areas. One is geography of entrepreneurship, second area is social capital and entrepreneurship, and third is evolution of learning and innovations. And you'll hear much more from Olav and comments about his research in a minute or two. But before we proceed, I would like to turn to Helena Stålnert, who is going to take us through this afternoon and the prize ceremony. And Helena is an experienced moderator. Most of us know your face from SVT as a news anchor for many years, foreign correspondent, and you've also been vice president of steel company SSAB, and you worked for the defense company Saab. And the floor is yours, and we look forward to you guiding us through this afternoon.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I look very much forward to this coming 1.5 hours. Everybody speaks about entrepreneurship those days. It's a condition for the economy to grow. If the entrepreneurs can't grow, the economy won't grow either. So it will be very exciting to discuss this with you the coming hour. And before we start with that, I would like you to look around, especially those of you who haven't been here before. Isn't this an amazing place? This was inaugurated in 1899. It's called the Hall of Mirrors, and it is inspired by the same Hall of Mirrors in Versailles outside Paris. And as we are going to have a prize ceremony today, I can tell you that this was in fact the place where the Nobel Prize was handed out the first time in 1901. So it has a history for prizes, this place. Before we start with the prize ceremony, we will have some music. Please let me introduce you the Lilla Akademin. Thank you so much, Lilla Akademin. Now it's time for the prize ceremony, and I would like to ask the Minister for Higher Education and Research, Mrs. Helene Hellmark Knutsson, to join us at the scene. Give her a warm welcome. And now, Minister will present to you the winner and the motivation. Please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity for me to be here today. It's truly a great honor to present the Global Award for Entrepreneurship Research. And I just want to say a few words before I will read the motivation for you. And that is, Sweden prides itself on being a knowledge society. Our global competitiveness depends on our ability to create and to develop, to make practical use of new scientific discoveries. In short, our capacity to innovate. And the government is committed to making sure that Sweden remains a world leader in innovation and in research. Therefore, we will continue to invest in knowledge and competence, and creative industries are flourishing in both Sweden and, of course, here in Stockholm, and innovative, open-minded people are moving to our country. But when we consider the big challenges facing our society today, like climate change, inclusive society, energy, health, and aging population, just to mention a few, we know that the ability to find solutions for these challenges is within innovation and research. Solutions that are economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable. And I also would like to mention something about our country's future, because that is our students. It is the students who are the carriers of new knowledge into the labor markets and to all parts of society, both private and public sector. And it is essential that students within all higher education is trained into entrepreneurial and creative thinking. And my starting point for higher education policy in Sweden is that we must increase the possibility for lifelong learning across the whole country. And therefore, the Swedish government has invested in the expansion of 25,000 seats across universities and university colleges during our term in office. And if Sweden wants to continue to compete in the global economy with a highly skilled labor force, collaboration between universities, industry, and the public sector must continue onwards. And the name of our research bill, Collaboration for Knowledge, tells you something about the Swedish policy in this area. Collaboration between university, industry, and the public sector is one of the cornerstones in the Swedish innovation system. And lastly, I would like to say that even though Sweden's efforts in innovation is strong, the challenges of today can't be solved by one single researcher or university or industry. We need all to strengthen our collaboration between the academia, industry, and private sector if we are to face our global challenges together. With these few remarks, I really would like to read the motivation for today's prize award winner, Professor Olav Sorenson. And Professor Olav Sorenson, outstanding contribution build on the notion that entrepreneurial activity and innovation are strongly embedded in socially and spatially bounded relationships. By combining insights from sociology, economic geography, and economics, he has provided new understandings that challenged established views on the microeconomic foundations of spatial formations, knowledge diffusions, and interactions among economic agents. His foremost contribution in entrepreneurship and innovation research can be categorized into three fields: the geography of entrepreneurship, social capital and entrepreneurship, and the evolution of learning and innovation. Based on meticulous microeconomic data analysis, Professor Sorensen's work has brought new insights in all three areas. Please, Mr. Sorensen. So.
Wow, okay, thank you. I already have two hands full.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And now we will have the pleasure to listen to a lecture by Mr. Sorensen, and we can take care of this for the time being.
Okay.
So the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. So before jumping in, I would like to thank the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum and the Research Institute for Industrial Economics for creating and sponsoring this award. I mean, I think that no one starts to study entrepreneurship because they think they're going to win this prize, but the prize, nevertheless, I think brings a lot of attention to the field, and it has been important to, kind of helping to establish its legitimacy across a wide range of researchers. 20 years when I sort of started getting into this, there were many fewer people interested in entrepreneurship than there are today. I'd also like to thank my wife, who has been a constant supporter and sounding board. My wife is an economist, so that also, sort of forces me to defend my ideas all the time. And I'd also like to thank a range of co-authors. I have more co-authors than these, but these have been the co-authors who have probably been most consistent over the years. And none of these papers would have been as good without them involved, and many of them probably never would have been written. So a lot of this, sort of the recognition here should also go to their contributions as well. So I want to sort of tell you just a little bit of a story about kind of how I got into thinking about entrepreneurship. So I started graduate school in the mid-1990s in Silicon Valley. That was a very unusual time. It was basically the start of the kind of dot-com boom or bubble, depending on what your perspective is. And being on Stanford's campus at that time, I had friends who were constantly talking about the latest startup, and actually many of them exited graduate school without finishing so that they could join a startup. It was a really unusual time. If I try to imagine what the gold rushes must have been like in the 19th century, I think it must have been a lot like Silicon Valley in the mid-1990s. I wasn't really interested in joining a startup by myself, but that did get me reading a number of the works on economic geography because I was interested in what is it, kind of about a region that makes a region successful. And that was quite interesting and I think quite influential to my thinking. But then I sort of encountered data. And the first way that I encountered data was actually through an interview. So like any good Silicon Valley story, this one involves an entrepreneur in a garage. So as part of the research, trying to understand a little bit better how entrepreneurs made decisions about where to locate their businesses, I went out and did some interviews with entrepreneurs. And one of the first ones that I went to was somebody who had, kind of one of these mission style, or I guess this is craftsman style, garages, and had his business as a garage. I went in there, the table was filled high with, the old 3.5-inch floppy disks that come in plastic cartridges. As we got into the interview, I said, well, so, why did you start your business here? And his response was, well, because my wife didn't want the mess in the kitchen. So, when I asked him the question, he thought I was asking him why the garage, not some other part of the house, rather than why Silicon Valley instead of, some other place in the country. And as I kind of pushed a little bit further and tried to find out a little bit more about his thinking, I found out, well, he had kids in school here, his wife had a job here, they had relatives in the area. It was sort of inconceivable for him that they would be moving someplace else. And that really got me to start thinking about reconsidering some of the premises of what I would say are the kind of classics of economic geography. The premises of those are really that entrepreneurs are making very rational decisions, are looking out at a lot of different potential locations about where they might put their business, and then, choose the one that they think is likely to maximize their profitability. Now, in some ways, I think that's right, but a lot of what the research that I've been doing over the last 20 years has been trying to think about how social networks influence those decisions, influence not just the decisions that they make, but also what areas are the best areas for them. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that part of my research for the next roughly 25 minutes or so. So I think there's three main, kind of ways in which social networks are important to the entrepreneurial process. I'll think of these as kind of relational mechanisms. So I think the three, so one is determining appropriateness, and I'll say a little bit more about what that means, but I think there's a process of which people have to decide to become an entrepreneur in the first place, and a lot of that has to do with peers and who one sees as similar to oneself. Then once you've decided to start a business, you have to get the resources together to get it going. You have to obtain funding, you have to hire people, you maybe have to get suppliers, find your first customer. Again, social networks matter to every one of those stages. And the last thing that I'll talk about is a little bit getting back to that entrepreneur in his garage. There's also an issue in which, kind of social relationships are an amenity, right, of a place. So, we like to spend time with our friends and relatives, and so it's costly for us to think about moving someplace else. So starting out with the kind of appropriateness. So one of the things, one of the first projects that I did on entrepreneurship was looking at the shoe industry. And one of the things that I thought would be interesting to do to get a better sense of it is I went out and found every biography that had been written about an entrepreneur who had started a shoe company. It turns out there's more than 20. Who knew? A lot of them were probably vanity presses. But anyway, they still have a lot of background about the entrepreneurs. And one of the things that was interesting is that, first of all, essentially without an exception, every one of those entrepreneurs had been employed in an incumbent footwear manufacturer before becoming an entrepreneur themselves. They'd usually been a plant manager, sometimes they'd been a line manager, but they had experience in the industry. The second thing that stood out is that every one of them talked about some eureka moment, some point at which they thought, I don't have to be working for this big company, I could go off and start my own firm. And a lot of times that eureka moment was seeing somebody else, somebody that they saw as a peer, starting their own business. That might have been another plant manager at a different plant for their company, or maybe at a rival firm, but seeing somebody else engaged in the process. I think there's at least 3 reasons why, kind of seeing these peers matter in terms of creating a type of demonstration effect. So the first is that part of it is just, there's a lot of uncertainty, not just in the types of businesses that people create, but also uncertainty about oneself. Do I have what it takes to become an entrepreneur? If I see somebody who's similar to me, that I perceive as having the same kind of skills, background, ability as I do, becoming an entrepreneur, that increases my confidence that I could do it as well. The second is you could think that there's also some information just generally about whether or not starting a business is a good idea at this time. So irregardless of, kind of my own abilities, does it seem like there's a lot of economic activity in the shoe industry? The third is really thinking about, is this, and this is where I'm thinking about appropriateness, an appropriate activity, right? So in a lot of places, being an entrepreneur is maybe not frowned upon, but it's not seen as high status as maybe being a doctor or a lawyer or being an executive at a large company. And that, of course, then means that anyone who's becoming an entrepreneur bears a social cost. But the more people you know, the more people that are in your social circle that are entrepreneurs, the less that social cost is. And so it's easier for you to think about becoming an entrepreneur yourself. So I'm going to show you, kind of just one kind of illustrative study here. This is actually one of the few that I've done some research in this area, but this is not my own. This is actually by one of my co-authors, Jesper Sorensen, but I think it's one of the nicest ones in terms of illustrating this effect. So what he did is he looked at, let's look at all the employees of different size firms, and let's look at on the vertical axis, we've got what is the percent of those individuals who become entrepreneurs themselves, and then the green and the red bars are basically, the green bars are, do you have entrepreneurs, do you have peers who themselves had been entrepreneurs in the past? And the red bars is you don't have any peers that had been entrepreneurs in the past. And so what you see is that there's actually a pretty big difference in your likelihood of becoming an entrepreneur. If you've been exposed to other entrepreneurs, you're much more likely to become an entrepreneur yourself, particularly if you're working for a smaller firm. So the horizontal axis is what is the size of your employer, 0 to 4 employees, 5 to 9, and so forth. This kind of effect, this exposure effect, has been found actually in a lot of different settings. So it's been found in terms of roommates and dorms. It's been found in terms of coworkers. It's been found recently in terms of neighbors, kind of people in your neighborhood. Over and over again, we find that exposure to entrepreneurs matters in terms of encouraging other people to attempt entrepreneurship. But once you decide to that you're going to try to found a firm, then there's another issue, which is acquiring the resources. So that could be the funding to get the company going. A lot of funding we know comes from friends and family. But there are other types of resources that matter as well. So we could think about trying to recruit the first employees. That's probably even harder than getting funding, right? Whereas an investor can potentially diversify away from the risks associated with any business. Most employees are, have one job. And so if they join a firm, they're really tethering themselves to the fate of that company. Again, I think that in acquiring resources, social networks matters for 2 or 3 reasons. So one is that it just means that the resource holder has more information about the entrepreneur. So if that resource holder is maybe the financier, they have a better sense whether or not the entrepreneur can do it. If that resource holder, or if you think about a potential employee, they may have greater confidence in the individual. What may be even more important, though, than information is actually a type of bias. So one of the things that we know from research on social psychology is that people that we interact with commonly, we just tend to have higher opinions of. We think more favorably of them. We also tend to think more favorably of their ideas, right? So it's not a very far stretch to think that when one of our friends comes up with an idea of company, we have higher expectations for its odds of succeeding than some objective third party would. And because of that, you're more likely to get friends, family, acquaintances to invest in your venture. You're more likely to get them to come as employees. One of the early studies that I did on this was relating this as being kind of a reason behind why we see venture capital funding being a highly local activity. So this is from a paper that I wrote with Toby Stewart back in 2001, and basically what we're looking at here is this is the probability of receiving venture capital funding from a particular venture capital firm. And on the horizontal axis, we're looking at the distance between the headquarters of the venture capital firm and the headquarters of the startup company. And here we're only looking at the very first round of funding. So the seed, the Series A, the first financing that goes to the company. And what you see is it just drops off a cliff. Right? So once you get more than, really about 50 kilometers away from the venture capital company, your odds of receiving funding are extremely low. And when you start getting, kind of to the distance of 200, 400 kilometers, it's almost non-existent. Part of that, again, is kind of this information effect. In venture capital, there's also a bit of a post-investment role, which is that venture capitalists are active investors. They want to be able to continue to advise and work with the entrepreneur after they invest in it. That's harder to do if you're more distant from the company. And so that also partially drives this effect. The third idea, though, that I'd like to call attention to, this idea of kind of social networks as amenities. So the first two you could think a bit about being as sort of functional in the sense that you're getting more information about entrepreneurship as an activity, you're better able to raise resources, but this is one where really, you could think about social relations here being part of the preference structure, part of where people would like to be located. This is a fairly simple one. We like to spend time with family and friends. There's a recent study that I really like in this done by Christopher Young, who's at Stanford Sociology Department. So he looked at how likely people were when they were doing sort of almost like a daily journal entry to say that they had positive versus negative thoughts. And what he found is that on weekdays, people tended to have fewer positive thoughts than on weekends. Okay, that's not surprising. What's more surprising is that he found exactly the same pattern for people that didn't have jobs. And so as he dug into it, what he discovered is that, what happens is that for people who are, not working for one reason or another, they're out of the labor force, they have a lot of time and flexibility during the week, but they don't have any, they have very few friends, family to spend that time with. And so they don't get the same kind of satisfaction as they do on the weekend when they're able to socialize also with people that they would like to spend time with. Here, the way that I've looked a little bit at this kind of question of amenities to think about the choice of where people locate, whether that's locating their business as an entrepreneur or even locating as an individual, as a type of revealed preference in some sense. So how much do people want to be near friends and family? So this is using Danish registry data, a study with Makya. And we were looking at, in a series of studies, what types of factors predicted where people would move to. right? And the interesting thing is the most important factor, of course, was just staying near one's current home. That's where most of your friends and family are. But then if we looked at, kind of where you were likely to move to, well, if you move, you're most likely to move either to where your parents were, or then high school classmates, or where college classmates were, where you've lived in the past. Expected income was all the way down at number 6, right? So we think about, people tending to move, primarily for economic opportunity, and yet that actually seems to be a relatively minor factor in their actual choices of a location. It is, however, more important than being next to siblings. Maybe a bunch of people couldn't get over some things from their childhood. There's another way that we could kind of look at that is think about, well, how big would this potential economic gain have to be in order for us to be indifferent between the location that we're the two locations that we're considering. So two locations, one that's twice as far away from our current home as the other, we would need to get about a $39,000 increase in our expected annual wage in order to be sort of indifferent between those two. And you can see the economic effects for all of these are quite large relative to the average wage in this period in Denmark for this set of people, which is $68,000. So those are kind of the basic ideas in terms of what the main mechanisms are behind how relationships operate. None of those actually connect social networks to geography. What connects social networks to geography is the fact that almost all of our friends and family are located near to us, particularly friends. And there's both a sort of an opportunity side of that. If you think about who do you meet on a regular basis, you meet people through school, at work, running errands, and all of those are activities that happen in close proximity to your home. So you're primarily meeting people that live near you, and you're most likely to maintain relationships also with people that are living near you. It's much easier to do so. If you have a kind of casual acquaintance, you're only going to maintain it if you're running into the person repeatedly. Even if you sort of plan events, you plan to have lunch or coffee or something, that's easier to do if you're in close proximity. So what are the kind of implications of this? I think that there's a number of implications, but I'll go through a couple that I think are the most interesting. So one, and the most obvious one, is for entrepreneurs. For entrepreneurs, it means that the place that you're most likely to be successful as an entrepreneur is actually the place that you've been living for a long time. So if you don't live in Silicon Valley and you're thinking about starting a tech company, you should probably think twice before you move there. This again is some work with Makya. And we're comparing, so how do ventures perform when a person has lived in an area? In this case, this graph is showing somebody that's lived in an area for 4 years at least, versus somebody who's lived less than 4 years. We were calling an immigrant to the area. And what you see is that the locals have ventures that are much more likely to survive over a long period. This is just the survival graph, but we can also look, they also have higher growth rates in terms of growth in sales and sales of employees. They're also more profitable. So consistently, entrepreneurs do better when they open businesses in their home regions. Again, I think a lot of this is due to their ability to mobilize capital to get the right early employees to get suppliers, and to get early customers. We could also think about, kind of implications for industries. And actually, this is what first got me into thinking about entrepreneurship, and that's, what is the geography industries. One of the things that has been noted in a lot of industries is that industries are highly concentrated. So this is every footwear plant in the United States, first in 1940, and then in 1980. One of the things that maybe isn't immediately obvious, although it should be fairly easy to see, is that they look pretty similar, right? Now, one idea would be, well, maybe what's happening here is that all of these plants that were there in 1940 are still there in 1980. But in fact, during this period, there's more than 5,000 entries and exits on a population of about 1,000 firms, right? So almost none of the firms that are there in 1940 are still there in 1980. These are different companies, but they're located in the same place, right? And why does that happen? Well, the reason why it happens is that we sort of think about where entrepreneurs come from. Think back to those biographies. Almost everyone had been working for a shoe plant. So that means they'd been working at one of these incumbent firms in the industry. And when they start their venture, they're most likely to start it in the same place that they had been living and working, right? So they're going to start their new business in exactly the same types of places or the same place that they had been working. And so these clusters of firms continue on even though they may not be economically beneficial. In fact, if we looked at the kind of performance of the plants that were not near competitors did much better. So the vertical axis here is the multiplier of the exit rates. So those that are located in these clusters were failing at anywhere from 50% to 300% higher rates than those that were located in more in areas where they didn't have their competitors around them, and yet we see the cluster persisting. And it's due entirely to entry. We did an analysis where we said, how long would it take for this industry to reach geographic equilibrium? So if entry were random, if entrepreneurs were just sort of randomly appearing with the distribution of the population, the industry would have reached equilibrium in about 8 years. But because entry is almost entirely happening in the same places that we already have clusters of firms, equilibrium was predicted to take almost 100 years to reach. The problem is that over 100 years' time, it's quite likely that the equilibrium distribution also changes. And so in some sense, the geographic distributions of industries are never in equilibrium. I started this in shoe industry, and people might think, well, shoe is kind of old economy, manufacturing, not that interesting. But we showed that exactly the same type of thing happens in biotechnology, where again, the clusters are persisting in places like South San Francisco and San Diego, even though those are the worst places in terms of the expected performance of the firms. And others have shown that it happens in a number of other industries. So I started this thinking about Silicon Valley, and one of the reasons that I think that this kind of issue is important with respect to clusters is that there's oftentimes been an interest from policymakers to try to be the next Silicon Valley. And they think the way to be the next Silicon Valley is to create a cluster around some particular industry. But I think there's a lot of risk in that. And if we really think about it, and we go back a century, the Silicon Valley of the 1920s was Detroit, right? It was the boom town during the when the automobile industry was burgeoning. Ford, Chrysler, all of the big makers, all of the big entrepreneurs in the industry were located there. But because it was so concentrated in the automobile industry, when the automobile industry began to shrink, Detroit also began to decline. And so now it's become our sort of poster child for a failed city. So with that, I will turn it over to the panel. Thank you.
I think that was very interesting and very inspiring for the panel. I would like now to ask you to move over there in the middle there, and you will be surrounded by other professors. So let's hear what they have to say. And first of all, I would like to invite the Minister Helene Hellmark Knudsen to join us again on the scene. And then I would like Karin Torbjørn, who is professor at the Center of Corporate Finance at the Norwegian School of Economics, and also a member of the Prize Committee. If you stand here on this side, please. And then I would like to ask Magnus Henriksson also to join us. Magnus Henriksson is professor and managing director of the Research Institute for Industrial Economics. Most welcome. And I would like you to stand on the other side over there, yes, please. It's a little bit cozy, isn't it? And then I would also like to ask Johan Eklund once again to join us here. Maybe you can stand on the side over there. This will be a short discussion. It's a little bit like speed dating among professors, if you want. And I would like to start with asking the panel to give your reflections on what you have heard, and then I will ask Olaf to comment on what they say. So let's start with the minister, please.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for a very interesting lecture. It was really interesting to hear, and I think you made out some really important remarks, especially the ones that we all need role models, or what you call peers, to inspire us and to take this leap to start up a company or becoming an entrepreneur. And I think that is very much so. So you have to sort of create these kind of clusters, or we like to call it the ecosystems that you need. And therefore, when I had my small speech in the beginning, I think it's really important for me to mention the students, because when we ask companies around Sweden, what is the most important for you to make an investment or to decide where to locate your new facility? It could be the company, or it could be also the manufacturing plant. They say it's to be near students. It's the most important things, because we need to have this skilled, educated, but they are also the one that will be most likely to perhaps build a startup or create a new idea or try a new idea. And I think to build this kind of ecosystem, you have to have different parts. You have to have the big companies, the large companies, but you also need the small and mid-sized enterprises, and also startups. But then if you also have a university campus, you will also have the students there, and they could also be a part of this sort of vibrant geography. And I think what we are lacking of in Sweden is the venture capital. That I think is the big problem. So therefore it's even more important that you have the big companies, but you also have the public sector that could be, I mean, like a public procurement that could be sort of the one financing and trying new ideas in a larger scale. So, and I also, third and lastly about this, that you tend to stay where you where you grow up, because that's where you have your family, your friends, and this is also something we know, that where you are educated, you try to sort of stay there. So therefore, it's important for us in Sweden to invest in universities, both when it comes to higher education, but also research all over the country, because like 50% of our export industry, it's outside the big cities and outside the university cities, because it's based on nature resources like forest, steel, and other things. And we have to sort of create these ecosystems in more places than just Stockholm and Uppsala and Gothenburg, for instance, and see if we can do it also in the northern parts of Sweden. And therefore, we need to have strong universities all over the country. We are a big country with not that many people, so we need to create these kind of clusters on several places around the country.
Big country, but not as big as US, though. Kari, what's your reflections?
Well, first I would like to congratulate Professor Sorensen to a very interesting research portfolio. I think what characterizes great research is that after the fact it seems obvious. Like Helena, when we talked initially, she said, but this doesn't sound new, didn't we already know this? But of course we didn't. And then with respect to your research, I think it's very interesting to reflect on it in the light of that so much has happened in the past decade when it comes to networking. I mean, not only socially, people network way more on the internet today. We have professional networks like LinkedIn, but we also have the venture capital-oriented networks like AngelList or Funded by Me or other platforms, which I think might have interesting implications for the importance of geography going forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Magnus Henriksson, what's your reaction?
I mean, there's a lot of, coincidence, a lot of chance involved. I mean, something has to start, and it could be a bit of a by hazard. It starts. Why Silicon Valley? We had the prize winner here, Stephen Klepper, a few years ago. He came out with a book. It didn't come out until after his death, but there he explains that William Shockley, who was one of the co-founders of the transistor. He was at Bell Labs in New Jersey, but he spent his childhood summers in Silicon Valley in the orange groves there, and he felt that that's where he wanted to start his company, Fairchild Industries. And he was and everybody wanted to work for this guy. He was also a Nobel laureate at the time because of that. And all the brilliant people went there, worked for him, but he was a terrible control freak. And people like Andy Grove, Gordon Moore, Robert Noyce, those who became really in the second generation super important, they left because he was so terrible. So they started Intel and other industries. And then at Stanford, there was a smart president of Stanford who realized that there's a symbiosis here. And that was, I guess, known even before with Hewlett and Packard and so on, even back in the 1930s even. And one has to realize that it's true, you have all these things, but Sweden, we can't have Stanfords everywhere. There's so many states in the US with 10 million population that do not have a brilliant university. So therefore, we have to think of what are the premises here in our locality. You cannot duplicate that. And if you're lucky, you get one or two really great places. But there can't be a good university in every little place in Sweden, which there isn't one in Montana. Probably isn't one in Idaho, and that's not that far from California. So you have to think of that and don't get carried away and say, now, as you said, now we're going to go do more or less the same thing as they did in Silicon Valley.
Thank you, and Johan, your reflections, please.
First of all, I've just noting how you bring together various fields of social science, so bringing together sociology with economics, etc. That's worth reading in itself. But I'd like to take the opportunity to ask you, Professor Sorensen, a few questions. And first of all, I'm getting personal, but I'm coming from a region which would probably be considered laggard region, where there is certainly social cost associated with becoming an entrepreneur, Finspång, those of you who know this town. So what can policymakers do to reduce social cost? Can they do anything? So really the policy implications of your research. And then continuing with I love your shoe example and how how successful entrepreneurs are coming out of incumbent firms. And I know you've done research on Denmark and Danish data, but here there are some significant differences between Denmark and Sweden. For example, in the labor market regulations, the size of the country, etc. So perhaps if you could at least speculate on the policy implications, and coming back to lagging regions, can you improve the conditions for lagging regions through policy measures? The minister mentioned educational policy, but I can imagine that you have infrastructure policy, etc. So maybe if you could reflect on the ability of policymakers to, so to speak, substitute poor social networks and replace them. So those are my comments.
Okay.
Okay, Olaf, that was a lot of different views on your research. What do you say?
Would you like me to respond to them?
Absolutely.
Okay. So let me start with the minister. So I think education is a particularly interesting one with respect to thinking about mobility of individuals. And one of the reasons why is because it turns out that one of the most mobile times for most people is actually when they're transitioning from high school to college. That's when it's a pretty high likelihood of moving. So that is, in some sense, when if you're trying to influence where people are going, you probably have more ability to do it. And you're right that once they graduate, they're much more likely to stay in the region. Although if they don't, usually the next most is to go back home. But that also can be interesting, right? Because that can be a way of creating cross-regional connections, which are also, I think, valuable. So I think education is an interesting one. I also can relate very much personally to some of the issues here. I grew up in South Dakota, which is, on a probably density basis, even less populated than Sweden. So it's a big space with very few people, about 500,000. Crowdfunding is an interesting one. So The thing about crowdfunding that's interesting is that on the one hand, it seems to get around some of the problems of venture capital, which venture capital is very tightly clustered in a few locations. In the U.S., it's mostly in Boston, New York, Silicon Valley. My understanding is here it's mostly, I believe, in Stockholm. In Norway, it's pretty much only in Oslo. But crowdfunding has an advantage in that the people that are the crowdfunders are sort of every place. So that opens up access potentially. But the interesting thing about crowdfunding is some of the people that have been doing research on it find that at the beginning, the social networks are still critical because the first investments almost always come from, kind of friends, family, acquaintances, those that actually know you. And it's only once you get past a certain critical mass with that group that you then start to get more distance investments. And so I think it solves some of the geography problem, but it doesn't completely eliminate, kind of the importance of being connected.
May I ask you, is it still important, the picture you showed where venture capital comes from very sort of tight area from 50 kilometers or something? So it's still the case, you think, even though we have access to crowdfunding today?
So venture capital is still highly concentrated, but if you look at where crowdfunding goes, it goes almost everywhere. Okay. And so but they're much smaller. So even a large crowdfunding campaign might be $100,000. Seed rounds of venture capital can easily be $500,000 to $2 million. So we're talking a very different level of capital investment that's available between the two. The initial moves, I think this, kind of how places get started is a little bit idiosyncratic. One of the things that I do think is interesting about these studies is that all of the moves, though, were not actually to become entrepreneurs, right? So Shockley is moving in large part because he wants to go back to his sort of home. Grove and Noyce move because they're going to get jobs with Shockley, not because they think they're going to go off and, initially start Fairchild and then later be involved in founding Intel. So where these individuals come from is a little bit idiosyncratic. Actually, I think if there's one kind of main lesson from a lot of this research, I would say that regions shouldn't try to imitate Silicon Valley. They should try to think of ways that they can create their own kind of homegrown entrepreneurs, and also to try to have more diversified economies in general. And then, I want to kind of come back to the last one, sort of thinking about, well, how do we get the process started? So one of the difficulties is, so if you're thinking about, sort of trying to, particularly that, kind of appropriateness, or, kind of where role models come from. How do you get role models if you don't have any, right? I actually am encouraged by, there was an interesting field experiment that was done recently at Stanford by Chuck Easley, who's in their engineering school. And so he randomly assigned groups of students mentors who were either had experience as an entrepreneur or who had experience as a businessman. And what he found is that those that were randomly assigned mentors who had been entrepreneurs were more likely then to try to start ventures themselves going forward. So that's kind of interesting because that suggests that there may be a way to sort of seed mentors in regions that maybe don't have a lot of entrepreneurial culture by maybe bringing in people that would, run accelerators in the area and provide that kind of mentoring. Kind of coming to the more general issues of kind of labor. So this is a little bit different research, but one of the things that I have done some research on suggests that one thing that's really important to this process is sort of freedom of labor mobility. So in the U.S., a lot of labor law is at the state level. And one of the kind of important features of labor law that is interesting is whether or not states will enforce something called a non-compete agreement. So a non-compete agreement is something that you might sign when you first are employed with a company, and it basically says that you won't go to work for a competitor. And what we find is that in states that don't enforce non-compete agreements, so that would be places like California, Washington, you have much higher rates of entrepreneurship. And you seem to get much more effective growth out of each venture capital dollar than in areas that have more restrictive labor mobility. And that's important because a lot of countries, Canada has an extremely restrictive labor mobility regime. I think Sweden is on the more restrictive end of labor mobility as well. Because, there's two kind of parts to the process. One is the entrepreneur themselves being able to go and start a firm that might be, sort of seen as competing with their former employer. But even the bigger issue might be that person's ability to recruit employees to their firm, right? And if all those employees are locked up by non-compete agreements or, kind of the equivalent, then it's just very hard for them to get the talent they need to get their businesses started. Yeah.
I think we have, in most Western countries, we have a strong trend of urbanization. Big cities are growing even bigger, and the rest of the countries are more or less suffering. In what way do you think that your findings can contribute to sort of a better balance between the countryside and the big cities?
Well, I think that, I think if the infrastructure were there, a lot of people would want to remain in, kind of their hometowns or smaller towns. I think the difficulty is that right now, that the opportunities oftentimes are not there. And so they're, leaving probably when they are students and then not returning.
So better infrastructure, what do you say?
Well,
no, but I agree. That is why we try not to make them move to see that they could go to a university or university colleges back home. So therefore we invest in seats, new seats throughout the whole country, and also see that we have accessible broadband. And for them who are even further away from the universities, we also try to digitalize some of the education, so you can do it on the internet instead, so you don't have to move. And that is also, I think, very important for the lifelong learning, because if you have a job, you don't want to sort of quit a job and go to a university campus to live student life there, because you probably have family or a home already. So that is also something that we think is important, to invest in this lifelong learning, so you also can go to a university course and have access to internet courses instead of have to move. And I think it's also very important to see in the more countryside or rural areas that it's much harder to be an entrepreneur in this kind of regions. I mean, to come to Stockholm is the easy way to become an entrepreneur, because here you have all the infrastructure. So I think that is also, like I heard when I went to Skellefteå, a city up north in Sweden, they said, but innovation is a way to survive here. And I think that is also interesting, that if you are to stay in Skellefteå or other, you have to be innovative, and you have to attract capital and investment in another way than you have to do, because here it comes almost naturally.
Now, Magnus would like to say something.
Yeah, well, I think it's something that's different now from what it was like 40 years ago, is that wherever you grew up in the country, the mandatory school and the senior high school was of high quality or similar quality. We who grew up in small villages, we could go to schools that were equally good as those who grew up in Saltsjöbaden or in central Stockholm. Of course, this is not at all the case anymore. And this, I think, is the major reason why highly trained people do not want to go there and be manager of those businesses, because their own kids cannot find reasonably good schools. So therefore they don't want to go there. Doctors, they become stafettläkare instead, and they don't go there. They go there for a week, make a lot of money, go home to Lidingö. And it's true for, I mean, it's very difficult to get the intellectual elite if their kids cannot go to as high quality of schooling, mandatory school, up through age 19, if they live in this small place compared to living in a bigger city. And I think this is only the government that can fix that, and that's the most important thing for them to fix. And of course also police presence and so on, so you have rule of law and no organized crime and so on. And this is another problem, that you don't have any police in Arvika and you have a lot of police in central Stockholm. And of course, that's not good for business in Arvika if that's the case.
So let's hear what the government would like to do to improve the schools in the countryside.
Yes, of course, and that's why we say that we need to have teacher education not only at 6 universities in the big cities. We have to have teacher education at almost all our universities and university colleges, because they tend to stay where they are educated. So, and that is also what we do when it comes to education for new medical doctors or physicians, that we try to create academic environments outside the university campus, so they will do some of their education there to be able to stay there and to become medical doctors in the more rural areas, because we need to have the same welfare and school quality all over the country. That is absolutely vital, I think. But I also would just like to say, when we hear that we can only have 1 or 2 good universities, we have 3 top 100 universities in Sweden. We have 11 universities top 400 when we look at Times Higher Education. Örebro University is the last one that became one of the universities of top 400. And that is for a country with 10 million inhabitants and in a world with like 20,000 universities. So we have strong universities also aside of Karolinska Institute and Uppsala University and Lund University.
Karin?
So I think we've talked a lot about like how do you generate supply of entrepreneurs, and I'm thinking you mentioned accelerators. How do you have a mentor? Maybe that's something one could encourage in smaller regions. We talked about infrastructure, and then I'm thinking not only fiber but transportation, schools, which makes entrepreneurs want to live there. But then of course it's also the funding side, and I mean we talked about venture capital and crowdfunding. But I think an important source in the US is also the business angels, which are sort of in between in size. And the experience from Norway at least says that government funds and government seed funding cannot replace the private capital, that the private capital is a much better mechanism to allocate resources. And there I think it's also important to have a tax system and allow liquidity events, which you've also looked at, Professor Sorensen, that allows individuals to build up the wealth that they actually can help invest with, because I think that needs to be on the hands of private individuals to really be successful.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think angels, accelerators I'd been more thinking about in terms of the role model aspect of it and maybe education rather than as a funding source. Yeah, I think that it's true. I mean, we don't have as good data or studies on angels as we do on venture capital. It's hard that, nothing requires them to report their investments. So the data are a little bit spotty, but everything that I've seen suggests that there's at least as much money coming from angel investors, private individuals investing directly in businesses, as from venture capitalists, and that's oftentimes sort of crucial early money even before they get venture capital money. And that's, I think, it's both a question of a tax regime that that sort of motivates it or promotes it, but I think there's also a question of it being there's sort of seen as legitimate activity as well. I mean, I think what's really been a boom in the U.S. is, almost every, not even big cities, but even if you look at relatively small towns, have these groups of angels who will meet and invest as groups and will meet with entrepreneurs as group, and that starts to form part of the ecosystem even in these smaller towns. I mean, even New Haven has a couple of these groups where a couple of kind of former successful entrepreneurs organize breakfast events where they have entrepreneurs pitch their ideas, potentially get that first check from some local investors.
Of course, there's a huge difference between the United States and Sweden in a lot of senses. But if you look at the policy support to support entrepreneurship, what kind of measurement or initiative from government or for regional authorities and so on is the most important? In what way could the state or the support the entrepreneurship in the best way?
The most important.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's. I think that's a hard question. I mean, I think that. I think you can sort of think. I think the reason why it's a hard question is that it sort of depends on what the circumstances are in a local area, right? I mean, some places have sort of. They seem to have all the right ingredients. They maybe have a good university. They have some strong industries, and yet we're not seeing much entrepreneurship. Well, there maybe the important thing is that we need to sort of seed mentors or kind of examples, prototypes for those entrepreneurs. Other places, maybe they have people starting businesses, maybe in northern Sweden, but they're undercapitalized, because there's no local venture capitalists and maybe not a local angel community, and so it's hard for them to get the funds to get the businesses going. There, the answer might be some form of, policy subsidy or something that would bring, kind of an investor to the region. In other places, the problem is that we've had a restructuring, and so there's just too many people that have skills that don't fit the local, sort of industrial base. And I think it's probably difficult to hope that the way that that's going to solve is we're going to have enough entrepreneurs sort of starting things that we're going to get jobs going. And probably the right thing to do is to sort of actively target an industry that could be a good fit, bring in a large incumbent, and then what we typically see is that when a large, manufacturing plant or large service facility gets put in place, then people that are employed at that oftentimes learn the business, and then they, spin off and start new businesses. So the way to kind of seed that may not even be through trying to help the entrepreneurs directly themselves, but through, something we might see as a more traditional form of industrial policy, trying to bring in a large employer.
But still, in big cities like Detroit, they have a problem.
Well, Detroit has a big problem because they lost, kind of too many jobs in a very short period of time, and then they didn't have really any policies. They are actually starting to revitalize, though. I don't know if anyone's been to Detroit recently, but the thing that's been crucial there is actually a large employer, so Quicken, committed to moving most of its employment to Detroit, and has, it now employs thousands of people in Detroit, and that has been an important feature in kind of revitalizing the economy.
Johan?
I'm not sure if I'm running the risk of repeating what you just said, but I think that policymakers and policy pundits in a general sense needs to be clear about there is a policy trade-off, if I'm allowed to say that. You can have a policy target towards a laggard region, so you want to create conditions. You put the university there to create a condition, you create policies to substitute to create social networks, etc., in the region. Or you can have a policy, regional policy, and now I'm stealing an argument from a member of the price committee. You can have a regional policy for the individual, which allows that you put the university there in order to create social mobility, but that individual is never going to stay in the region. You're going to create the opportunity to move out. And that's two very different policies, and one needs to, if you start mixing them, you can end up with a rather confused policy mix, I think.
Magnus?
Yeah, we should be aware, of course, that, if you look at Detroit, but Birmingham, Alabama, and Baltimore, these large steel mill towns, they don't have entrepreneurship. And Finspång was the first Swedish industrial ironing place where De Geer arrived in the 1600s. And you have other places like that, whereas in Örnsköldsvik and Skellefteå and Gnosjö, of course, you didn't get that one very large traditional employer that kind of destroyed the entrepreneurial culture. Do you have any recipe for, can it be reignited, or because you see this enormous difference between, as you say, Finspång and Gnosjö, and they may only be 100 kilometers apart, or sometimes 30 kilometers apart, but cultures are totally different.
Yeah. I think that's a good question, and it made, I haven't, done research on that specifically, but I think it may depend a little bit on the type of industry that was there and who the former employees are. So, if you look at like Waterloo in Canada, research in motion is effectively dead, right? Probably nobody here has a BlackBerry anymore. But if it's the most entrepreneurial city in Canada right now. And the reason why is because all of these former RIM, software engineers, other engineers, they don't have jobs, and they've all gone and tried other things. There's lots of interesting technology. It is by far the most interesting kind of ecosystem right now in Canada, and it's a little bit of a combination of they've also done a lot at the university to try to help promote that sort of high-tech environment and to provide mentoring for the former RIM employees that are interested in entrepreneurship. I think it's harder when we're talking about, sort of like heavy industry, people that were maybe involved in manufacturing. It's harder to think about, what those skills would sort of transfer to in terms of, kind of being an entrepreneur. And that's where, the answer might be to think about first, could you bring in another large employer that might, do some of the reskilling as part of moving to a different industry, but hope that that employer would be in an area where there would be more possibility for entrepreneurship.
I would like to ask you another thing. We have a lot of discussions in Sweden about immigration because we have problems to integrate people coming from other countries. And you were talking about so much about the importance of having networks. And I think those people who are coming in from other countries now, they have left their home countries. They have maybe no relatives. They don't know anybody here. In what way could they create networks to be entrepreneurs in a substantial way?
I mean, there is a literature, one of the early literatures on entrepreneurship was on the U.S. and immigrant entrepreneur communities. So, Little Korea in Los Angeles, Little Havana in Miami. And the whole idea was that, yes, they oftentimes have difficulty entering the mainstream labor force, but the tight-knit community of immigrants from the same country means that they oftentimes can create a network that helps them in terms of maybe finding access to financing from within the community. So in Koreatown, in LA, there was a whole network of informal loans where other Korean immigrants would help each other sort of get started on a small business, and then they would sort of trade through this loan process. As well as employees. But, I mean, in the long run, you'd hope that they, I think, become integrated. One of the more recent papers that I've done is looked at, the kind of returns to venture capital. The cities that are better integrated in terms of less segregation seem to be more innovative in terms of the number of patents that come out, in terms of how innovative those patents are. They have more startups, and the startups are more successful. So, I mean, I'm not saying that, kind of it's hopeless for immigrants, but I also don't think they should be, it should be just left onto them. It's important to have them integrated into the larger communities that they live in.
To conclude this now, I would like to turn to Helene Hellmark Knudsen again and ask you, after listening to the lecture and after listening to this discussion, what will you do when you come back to office?
I will continue some of the things that we already do. Like I said, that we are expanding the number of seats on our universities throughout the country. But I think there are some things that I really will sort of consider, and I think the most important thing is that the role model discussion, I think, and also the last question that you have of the immigrants, because I met with a young man from Iraq who's been in Sweden for 1.5 years. He was a trained engineer, like a lot of people that came from Middle East, but he can't get a job within the traditional industry because he doesn't have a Swedish engineer education. And that is a problem that we have. But he was now trying to start up a company instead, and he had met and formed this network in Makya outside Stockholm. And he said, the number one thing for me is, and for all the immigrants to be able to find a job or start a company or whatever, is contacts. We really need contacts. So to find this kind of system, how we can provide and see that the universities could work with their alumni or whatever to be these kind of role models and sort of be contacts also for the immigrants. I think it's really important. And it was also really interesting to hear the difference between having an entrepreneur as a contact person while you are educated instead of having just a person from the industry. So this is something that I will take from this discussion and lecture, because I think we are able to have entrepreneurial areas around all the country. It's not just in 2 places we can have this. And like I said, I see in the northern parts of Sweden now great changes. And that comes from, instance, from Facebook having located one of their big data centers up in Luleå. So we have got this diversity. From the beginning, it was only the iron and steel industry, but now we have more diversity, and we see that it could also be a good thing to be in a cold part of the country. So they are attracting even more investments from Facebook now to have larger data centers up there. So perhaps we could create this environment in more places than just in Stockholm, and I think that would be what we continue to do and learn a lot from your research. So thank you.
So thank you so much, the panel. Give them a big applause.